Welcome to Criminal Nights. Tonight, I'll take you into the shadows of true crime, where hotel corridors echo with screams that were never heard, and elevator doors open to horrors that check in but never check out. I'm your host, and tonight, we begin a journey through 5 of the most chilling hotel crimes that have ever stained the hospitality industry with blood. Before we step into these cursed hallways together, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Criminal Nights, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from, because knowing you're out there, somewhere in the darkness with me, makes these stories feel less like nightmares and more like shared warnings. The Cecil Hotel's Dark Secret, February 19th, 2013. I still remember the taste of fear in my mouth as I stood outside the Cecil Hotel in downtown Los Angeles. The building loomed above me like a monument to human suffering, its 14 floors casting shadows that seemed to swallow the California sunlight whole. I wasn't there as a tourist. I was there because a 21-year-old Canadian student named Eliza Lamb had vanished into thin air, and the last anyone had seen of her was in the most disturbing elevator footage ever captured. The Cecil Hotel had been my obsession long before Elisa's disappearance. Built in 1924, this structure had witnessed more death than any building should, but as I pushed through those revolving doors for the first time, breathing in the stale air that reeked of decades of desperation, I had no idea I was about to uncover a connection so twisted, so impossibly dark, that it would haunt my dreams for years to come. The lobby was a time capsule of faded grandeur, cracked marble floors, tarnished brass fixtures, and walls that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Behind the front desk, a clerk with hollow eyes looked up at me with the kind of weariness that comes from working in a place where hope comes to die. "You're here about the girl," he said before I could speak. It wasn't a question. "Eliza Lamb," I confirmed, pulling out my recorder. "I understand she was staying here when she disappeared." The clerk, his Namatag Reed Miguel, glanced around nervously before leaning closer. "Room 506, he whispered. "But that's not where you'll find your answers." The elevator footage had already gone viral by the time I arrived. 4 minutes of Eliza Lamb behaving in ways that defied explanation, pressing multiple floor buttons, hiding in the corner as if someone was pursuing her, having what appeared to be a conversation with an invisible presence outside the elevator doors. The way she moved, the terror in her body language, the desperate gestures. It was like watching someone fight for their life, against an enemy only she could see. But I needed to see that elevator for myself. The hotel manager, a thin woman named Patricia, whose face looked like it had been carved from worry lines, reluctantly agreed to show me the 14th floor. As we rode up in the same elevator where Eliza had filmed her final moments, I felt the walls closing in around us. "People think this place is cursed," Patricia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe they're right." Floor 14 was where they kept the water tanks, 4 massive black cylinders that supplied water to the entire hotel, accessible only through a locked door, up a ladder, and across the roof. The police had searched everywhere for Eliza, every room, every closet, every possible hiding spot, but they hadn't thought to look in the one place no guest should have been able to reach. It was a maintenance worker who found her. February 27th, 2013. Guests had been complaining about the water pressure, about the strange taste, about the dark color coming from their taps. Some had been drinking it, bathing in it, brushing their teeth with it, for 19 days. When they opened the tank, Eliza Lamb's body floated to the surface like a terrible secret, finally ready to be told. I spent hours on that roof, trying to understand how a young woman with no access could have ended up in a water tank that required tools to open. The ladder to reach the tanks was secured. The rooftop door was locked and alarmed. The tank's heavy lid had no handles on the inside. Once you fell in, there was no way out. But here's what the police reports didn't tell you. What I discovered only after speaking with the night security guard who'd been working the shift. Alyssa disappeared. The hotel's surveillance system had a gap, a blind spot that lasted exactly 17 minutes between 2:43 a.m. and 3 a.m. on February 1st, 2013. The night Eliza was last seen alive. 17 minutes. Long enough for someone to disable alarms, access restricted areas, and commit the perfect crime. She wasn't alone that night. The security guard told me as we stood in the same spot where the cameras had mysteriously malfunctioned. His hands were shaking as he lit a cigarette. I saw someone with her in the lobby around 2 a.m. Someone who knew this place better than any guest should. The Cecil Hotel's history reads like a catalog of human misery. Serial killer Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, lived there during his murder spree. Jack Unterweger, the Austrian journalist who was secretly strangling women, made it his home base. Suicides happened so regularly that the hotels stopped reporting them unless they involved guests from other floors. But as I dug deeper into Elisa's case, I uncovered something that chilled me to the bone. 3 other young women had disappeared from the Cecil Hotel in the past 15 years. 3 other cases where surveillance footage was mysteriously corrupted or missing. 3 other deaths ruled accidental or suicide, despite evidence that suggested otherwise. Sarah Chen in 1998, Maria Rodriguez in 2006, Ashley Thompson in 2011, all young women traveling alone, all found in impossible locations within the hotel. All cases closed quickly by overworked detectives who seemed eager to move on to the next tragedy. Managed to get copies of the original police reports, don't ask me how, and what I found made my blood run cold. Each woman had exhibited strange behavior in the days before her death. Each had mentioned feeling watched, followed, pursued by someone they couldn't identify, and each had been staying on floors where the surveillance system had experienced technical difficulties. There was a pattern here, a predator who knew the Cecil Hotel's every secret, every blind spot, every way to make a person disappear without a trace. As I sat in that dim lobby at 2 a.m., the same time Eliza had last been seen, I felt eyes watching me from the shadows. The few remaining guests moved through the corridors like ghosts, avoiding eye contact, speaking in whispers. The place felt infected with fear, contaminated by decades of violence and despair. "You shouldn't be here this late," a voice said behind me. I turned to see a man in a maintenance uniform, his face hidden beneath a baseball cap. There was something familiar about his posture, the way he moved through the lobby like he owned it. "I'm researching the Eliza Lamb case," I said, standing slowly. He stepped closer, and in the dim light, I caught a glimpse of his eyes, cold, calculating, amused. Ah, the girl in the water tank. Tragic accident. She was troubled, you know, mentally ill. These things happen. But his smile told a different story. This wasn't the face of someone offering comfort. This was the face of someone who enjoyed reliving his work. "How long have you worked here?" I asked, my hand moving slowly toward the panic button on my phone. I spoke with Della's daughter in 1991, 2 years after Della passed away. She told me her mother had nightmares about that phone call for the rest of her life. Convinced she could have saved Roland's life if she'd acted differently, Mom said. She could hear other voices in the background, Della's daughter explained. Men talking in low voices, like they were planning something. She wanted to call the police, but the hotel manager told her not to interfere with guest privacy. That decision haunted her until the day she died. The torture began that night. I know this because of what the crime scene revealed later, and because of witness statements that were buried in police files until I managed to uncover them through sources I can't name without putting them in danger. Room 1046 shared a wall with 1048, occupied that week by a traveling salesman named Donald Melvin. Donald heard things through that wall that no human being should ever have to hear, sounds that turned him from a confident businessman into a broken man who spent the rest of his life afraid of hotel rooms. It started around 2 a.m., Donald told me in our only interview, conducted in 1986 in a bar so dark I could barely see his face. Voices, multiple voices, and sounds like ... like someone was being hurt, deliberately, slowly. Donald described hearing Roland's voice pleading, begging for something to stop. But the other voices he counted, at least 3 distinct men, seemed to be enjoying themselves. They spoke in a mixture of English and what sounded like Italian, planning each new horror they would inflict on their victim. "I should have called the front desk," Donald said, his voice breaking after 50 years. "I should have done something, but I was scared. Scared they'd come for me next if they knew I was listening." The sounds continued for hours. Furniture moving, glass breaking, and screams that Donald said sounded like an animal caught in a trap, desperate and hopeless. January 5th, 1935, 10:30 a.m., Maid Mary Soptic knocked on the door of room 1046 for what she thought would be routine housekeeping. When no one answered, she used her master key and opened the door to a scene that would give her nightmares for the remaining 38 years of her life. Roland T. Owen was still alive, but barely. He was naked, bound to a chair with telephone cord, his body covered in cuts that had been made with surgical precision. Someone had tortured him for hours, keeping him conscious, keeping him aware of every slice, every burn, every moment of agony. But here's what the newspaper reports didn't tell you, what I discovered only after examining the original crime scene photographs. The cuts weren't random. They formed a pattern, a message carved into human flesh that the police couldn't interpret, or wouldn't interpret. "He was trying to tell me something," Mary said during our interview. "His lips were moving, but no sound was coming out. His eyes, God, his eyes were begging me to understand something, something important." Mary called the front desk immediately. The hotel manager, afraid of bad publicity, called a private doctor instead of the police. By the time Dr. Harold Flanders arrived, Roland had slipped into unconsciousness. He never woke up. Dr. Flanders' report, which I obtained through medical records that should have been destroyed decades ago, revealed the true extent of Roland's suffering. Over 40 distinct wounds, each made with a different type of blade. Burns from cigarettes applied in specific patterns. Evidence of torture techniques that Dr. Flanders had only seen during his military service in World War I. This wasn't a crime of passion, Dr. Flanders wrote in his private notes. This was the work of professionals who knew exactly how to cause maximum pain while keeping the victim alive as long as possible. The precision suggests medical or military training. Roland T. Owen died at Kansas City General Hospital on January 5, 1935. At 11:15 p.m., he never regained consciousness. He never revealed his real identity. And he never explained why 3 men had spent 48 hours slowly killing him in room 1046. The police investigation was a masterclass in incompetence or deliberate cover-up. Detective Ray Hearn, the lead investigator, focused on Roland's false identity rather than tracking down his killers. The crime scene was cleaned and reopened for guests within 3 days. Witnesses were discouraged from speaking to reporters, but I found Detective Hearn's son in 1988, and he told me something that changed everything I thought I knew about this case. His father hadn't been incompetent, he'd been terrified. Dad came home the night he examined room 1046 and locked every door and window in our house. Detective Hearn's son told me he moved us to my grandmother's house for 2 weeks and wouldn't explain why. Years later, when I became a cop myself, he finally told me the truth. The truth was that Roland T. Owen had been carrying information that could have destroyed some of Kansas City's most powerful families. Information about illegal gambling, political corruption, and connections to organized crime that reached into the highest levels of city government. Dad found a safety deposit box key hidden in Roland's shoe, his son explained. When they opened the box, it contained photographs and documents that could have sent a dozen prominent citizens to prison. The next day, those documents disappeared from the evidence room, and Dad was told to close the case. The 3 men who tortured Roland to death were never identified, never arrested, never brought to justice. They vanished into the shadows of Kansas City's underworld, protected by people with enough power to erase evidence and silence witnesses. But the story doesn't end there, because room 1046 at the President Hotel became infamous for more than just Roland's murder. Over the next 40 years, 17 other guests who stayed in that room died under mysterious circumstances. Heart attacks in healthy young men. Suicides by people who'd shown no signs of depression. Accidents that defied explanation. The hotel finally sealed room 1046 in 1975, claiming it was for renovations. But I spoke with hotel employees who told a different story. They said the room was haunted not by ghosts, but by the living, by people who returned periodically to relive their crime, to remember the screams that had echoed off those walls. In 1987, during my investigation, I convinced hotel management to let me spend one night in room 1046. What I experienced there convinced me that some crimes leave stains that can never be washed away. At exactly 1:30 a.m., the same time Roland had made his desperate phone call 52 years earlier, I heard voices through the walls. Men speaking in low tones, planning something terrible. I heard furniture moving, glass breaking, and sounds that made my blood run cold. But when I checked the adjacent rooms the next morning, they had been empty all night. Some people would call that a supernatural experience, but I know better. I know that in certain places, where enough violence has been committed, the very walls absorb the evil and play it back like a recording. Room 1046 wasn't haunted by the dead, it was infected by the memory of human cruelty. The President Hotel was demolished in 1978, 43 years after Roland T. Owen's murder. But before the wrecking ball touched that building, construction workers reported finding something hidden in the walls of room 1046, something the original investigators had missed. I managed to speak with one of those workers before he died in 1992. He told me they found a metal box containing photographs, documents, and a confession written in Roland's own handwriting during his final hours. A confession that named his killers, explained why he was murdered, and revealed connections to unsolved crimes across the Midwest. We turned everything over to the police, the worker told me, but within a week, we were all visited by men in expensive suits who made it very clear that we should forget what we'd found. My foreman got a promotion and transferred to another city. The rest of us got cash bonuses and promises of more work if we kept our mouths shut. Those documents disappeared into the same black hole that had swallowed the original evidence. But the names Roland wrote down in his final agony, the names of the men who tortured him to death, those names still circulate in certain circles, still whispered in the back rooms of Kansas City bars, where old-timers gather to share secrets they'll never tell their families. I have those names. I've spent decades tracking down the descendants of Roland's killers, following a trail of violence and corruption that stretches from 1935 to the present day. And I've learned something that chills me to the bone. The organization that ordered Roland's death is still active, still powerful, still willing to kill to protect their secrets. 3 years ago, while researching this case for a documentary that was never produced, I was approached by a man who claimed to be Roland T. Owen's nephew. He said his real name was Robert Baker, and he'd been searching for answers about his uncle's death for 60 years. We met in a diner on the outskirts of Kansas City, far from the downtown area where the President Hotel once stood. Robert Baker was 87 years old, but his eyes held the same intelligence and determination I'd seen in the crime scene photographs of his uncle. Robert came to Kansas City to expose a murder, he told me, not to commit one, to solve one. He'd discovered that his girlfriend, a woman named Mary Patterson, had been killed by the same men who later tortured him to death. He was trying to gather evidence to give to federal investigators. Mary Patterson had disappeared in Chicago 6 months before Roland's death. Her body was never found, but Robert had uncovered evidence linking her murder to the same organized crime network that controlled illegal gambling in Kansas City. My uncle was a journalist, Robert Baker explained. He specialized in exposing corruption. He'd been tracking this organization for 2 years, getting close to their inner circle, documenting their crimes. Mary's murder was the final piece he needed to bring them all down. But Roland underestimated his enemy's willingness to use torture as both punishment and warning. His death wasn't just about silencing one journalist. It was about sending a message to anyone else who might consider exposing their activities. They kept him alive for 2 days because they wanted him to suffer, Robert said, tears streaming down his weathered face. They wanted other journalists to know what would happen if they got too close to the truth. As we sat in that diner, sharing coffee and secrets that had been buried for decades, Robert Baker told me something that made my blood freeze. The organization that killed his uncle was still active, still using the same torture methods, still targeting journalists who got too close to uncomfortable truths. 3 reporters have died in Kansas City in the past 10 years, he said, all investigating corruption, all found in hotel rooms under suspicious circumstances. The methods change, but the message remains the same. Some stories are too dangerous to tell. He showed me newspaper clippings, police reports, and photographs that traced a pattern of violence stretching from 1935 to the present day. Journalists who suffered accidents while investigating political corruption, witnesses who died of natural causes before they could testify, evidence that disappeared from police custody. They're still out there, Robert warned me as we prepared to leave the diner. Still watching, still killing. And they know you've been asking questions about room 1046. I've thought about Robert Baker's warning every day for the past 3 years. I've noticed cars following me home from interviews. I've received phone calls in the middle of the night where no one speaks, but I can hear breathing on the other end. I've found evidence of someone breaking into my apartment while I was away, searching through my research files. But I refuse to be silenced the way Roland T. Owen was silenced. His story deserves to be told, even if telling it puts my own life at risk. The truth about room 1046 is that it was never just about one murder. It was about a system of corruption and violence that has operated in American cities for nearly a century, using torture and murder to silence anyone who threatens their power. Roland T. Owen died because he believed the public had a right to know the truth. Mary Patterson died because she was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and 17 other people died in room 1046 over the following decades, because that room had become a symbol, a reminder of what happens to those who ask too many questions. Tonight, as you sleep safely in your own bed, remember Roland T. Owen. Remember that somewhere in America, in hotels and motels and anonymous rooms, people are still being tortured to death by organizations that consider murder just another business expense. Remember that the battle between good and evil isn't fought on distant battlefields. It's fought in hotel rooms like 1046, where ordinary people face extraordinary evil and sometimes pay the ultimate price for doing what they believe is right. The President Hotel is gone, demolished and forgotten by most of Kansas City. But the evil that festered in room 1046 lives on, relocating to new hotels, new rooms, new victims who dare to challenge those who profit from darkness. Roland T. Owen's real name died with him, but his story lives on as a warning to all of us. Some secrets are protected by blood, and those who seek to expose them do so at their own peril. In our next chapter, we'll check into another hotel where the living proved far more dangerous than any ghost, and where a single night of terror revealed just how far some people will go to keep their darkest secrets buried. Next crime. The Ambassador Hotel's final performance, June 5, 1968, Los Angeles, California. The Ambassador Hotel's embassy ballroom pulsed with the energy of victory and hope. Senator Robert F. Kennedy had just claimed victory in the California Democratic primary, one step closer to the presidency that seemed destined to be his. I have stood in that same ballroom countless times, trying to understand how a moment of triumph could transform into one of America's darkest tragedies in the span of a heartbeat. But this isn't just the story you know from history books. This is the story they don't want you to know. The one buried beneath official reports and sealed testimonies. The one that reveals the Ambassador Hotel is more than just the site of a political assassination. It was a hunting ground where predators stalked their prey through marble corridors and crystal chandeliers, where the powerful came to indulge their darkest appetites, and where witnesses to their crimes had a habit of dying young. I first heard whispers of the deeper story in 1988, 20 years after that fateful night. I was investigating a series of unexplained deaths at the Ambassador. Guests and employees who died under suspicious circumstances in the years leading up to RFK's assassination. What I discovered was a web of corruption, blackmail, and murder that reached into the highest levels of Hollywood and Washington, D.C. The Ambassador Hotel wasn't just a luxury destination. It was a carefully orchestrated theater where the elite could live out their fantasies without consequence. And Bobby Kennedy walked into that theater on the night he was scheduled to die, surrounded by people who had every reason to want him silenced forever. Maria Santos was 19 years old when she started working as a cocktail waitress in the Ambassador's Coconut Grove nightclub in 1965. She was beautiful, ambitious, and naive enough to believe that serving drinks to Hollywood stars and political power brokers was her ticket to a better life. She had no idea she was being recruited for something far more sinister. I found Maria in 1989, living under an assumed name in a small town outside Phoenix. It took months to convince her to speak with me, and when she finally agreed, it was with the understanding that her real identity would never be revealed. Even 21 years later, she was still terrified of the people she'd worked for at the Ambassador. They called it entertainment, Maria told me, her hands shaking as she lit another cigarette. Special parties for VIP guests who wanted more than just drinks and dancing. Girls who were willing to do anything for the right price, and men who were willing to pay anything to do whatever they wanted. The Ambassador Hotel's top floors had been converted into private suites where California's power brokers could indulge in activities that would destroy their careers if made public. Politicians, studio executives, organized crime figures, and foreign diplomats gathered there regularly, protected by a security system that ensured absolute discretion. We signed contracts, Maria explained, not just employment contracts. Secrecy agreements that basically said we'd disappear if we ever talked about what we saw. And girls who broke those agreements did disappear, permanently. Maria described a network of prostitution, drug trafficking, and blackmail that operated out of the Ambassador Hotel for over a decade. Young women were recruited from bus stations and unemployment lines, promised legitimate work, then gradually coerced into serving the sexual appetites of men who could make or break careers with a phone call. But the operation wasn't just about money, it was about control. Hidden cameras recorded every encounter, creating a library of compromising material that could be used to manipulate politicians, silence critics, and ensure loyalty from people who might otherwise become problems. Senator Kennedy wasn't supposed to be there that night, Maria said, her voice dropping to a whisper. The party was supposed to be at a different hotel. Someone changed the venue at the last minute, and I heard the bosses arguing about it. They were angry, scared. They kept saying it was too dangerous, that there were too many people who wanted Kennedy dead. Robert F. Kennedy had been investigating organized crimes, infiltration of Hollywood and political circles. His brother Jack had already been killed, and Bobby had made it clear that he intended to continue the fight against corruption that had cost his brother his life. He was asking uncomfortable questions about drug trafficking, illegal gambling, and the connections between crime families and entertainment industry executives. The Ambassador Hotel was at the center of all of it. I spent years tracking down former employees, guests, and law enforcement officials who'd been connected to the hotel during the 1960s. What I found was a pattern of intimidation, blackmail, and murder that had been operating for years before Bobby Kennedy's assassination and continued long after. Detective Frank Morrison was one of the LAPD officers who responded to the shooting on June 5, 1968. When I interviewed him in 1991, he was dying of cancer and finally willing to talk about what he'd witnessed that night. The scene was chaos, Frank told me from his hospital bed, but it was organized chaos, if that makes sense. Like people knew exactly what to do, exactly how to handle the situation. There were men in suits who weren't hotel security, weren't LAPD, weren't FBI, but they were directing the investigation from the moment we arrived. Frank described how evidence was removed from the scene before it could be properly cataloged, how witnesses were separated and questioned by people who wouldn't identify themselves, how the official narrative was established within hours of the shooting. We found things, Frank said, his voice barely above a whisper. Documents, photographs, recordings that suggested this wasn't just about one gunman with political grievances. There were people at that hotel who had been planning something like this for months, maybe years. But when Frank tried to include those discoveries in his official report, he was told by his superiors that certain evidence was classified and would be handled by federal authorities. Evidence that was never seen again. Sirhan, the man convicted of assassinating Robert Kennedy, claimed he had no memory of the shooting. Psychological evaluations suggested he'd been in an altered mental state, possibly hypnotized or drugged. But the question that haunted investigators, and was never adequately answered, was who had access to Sirhan, who had the expertise to manipulate his mental state, and who benefited from Kennedy's death. I believe the answer lies in the Ambassador Hotel's hidden history as a center for illegal experimentation with mind control techniques, a program that involved both organized crime figures and rogue intelligence operatives. Dr. William Herman worked as a psychiatrist at UCLA in the 1960s, conducting research into hypnosis and behavioral modification that was funded by sources. He was told not to investigate too closely. In 1992, shortly before his death from natural causes, he agreed to speak with me about his work and its connection to the Ambassador Hotel. We were told we were working on techniques to help treat mental illness, Dr. Herman explained, but the applications were clearly military or interpolated. We were learning how to make people do things they would never normally do, how to create false memories, how to turn ordinary citizens into unknowing operatives. Dr. Herman described sessions that took place in private suites at the Ambassador Hotel, where subjects were brought in for what they believed were medical treatments, but were actually experiments in psychological manipulation. Some of the subjects were recruited from the hotel's staff, he said. Young people who needed money, who were told they were participating in harmless research studies. Others were brought in by handlers, who claimed to be helping them with drug addiction or mental health issues. The research was supervised by men who identified themselves only by code names and paid in cash that Dr. Herman later realized had been stolen from casino operations in Las Vegas, the same casinos that were controlled by organized crime families with connections to the Ambassador Hotel's ownership. We created monsters, Dr. Herman said, tears streaming down his face. We turned innocent people into programmable weapons, and when our work was done, when they were no longer useful, they were discarded like broken tools. Sirhan had been treated for emotional problems at a clinic in Pasadena that Dr. Herman later learned was a front for the mind control research program. Records from that clinic disappeared shortly after Kennedy's assassination, but Dr. Herman remembered Sirhan as one of their most responsive subjects. He was perfect for what they needed, Dr. Herman explained. Intelligent enough to follow complex instructions. Disturbed enough that his actions could be explained as the work of a mentally unstable individual, and isolated enough that no one would ask too many questions about his handlers. The night of June 5, 1968, Sirhan was seen at the Ambassador Hotel hours before the shooting, in the company of a woman who was never identified and a man who matched the description of one of Dr. Herman's research supervisors. Security cameras that should have recorded their movements mysteriously malfunctioned, leaving no evidence of who Sirhan had been with or what instructions he might have received. But Maria Santos remembered them. She was working that night, serving drinks to VIP guests in the hotel's private suites. When she saw Sirhan in the company of people she recognized as part of the hotel's criminal network, they were in suite 1240, Maria told me. I brought them drinks around 9 p.m. Sirhan was sitting in a chair, staring straight ahead, not responding when people spoke to him. The woman with him said he was preparing for his performance. At the time, I thought maybe he was an actor or entertainer. Now I know better. Maria described Sirhan as appearing to be in a trance-like state, responding only to specific verbal cues from his handlers. She watched as they gave him a small pistol and rehearsed his movements through the hotel's kitchen area, the same route he would take hours later to intercept Kennedy. They knew exactly where Kennedy would be, Maria said. They had his security details plans. They knew which route he'd take through the kitchen. They knew he'd be vulnerable for exactly the amount of time Sirhan would need to get close enough to shoot. The woman with Sirhan was later identified, through Maria's description, as someone connected to both the mind control research program and the criminal organization that operated out of the Ambassador Hotel. But when police tried to locate her after the shooting, they discovered she'd died in a car accident 3 days after Kennedy's assassination, an accident that investigators noted had several suspicious elements. Robert F. Kennedy's murder wasn't just a political assassination, it was the culmination of a criminal conspiracy that had been operating out of the Ambassador Hotel for years. A conspiracy that involved organized crime, rogue intelligence operatives, corrupt politicians, and entertainment industry executives who had everything to lose if Kennedy had become president. The cover-up began immediately. Witnesses who saw Sirhan with his handlers were discredited or silenced. Evidence was destroyed or classified. The official investigation focused solely on Sirhan as a lone gunman, ignoring mountains of evidence that suggested a broader conspiracy. But the criminal organization that had used the Ambassador Hotel as their base of operations made a crucial mistake. They assumed their network of blackmail and intimidation would protect them forever. They didn't account for the fact that some people can't be bought, threatened, or killed. People like Paul Schrade, a labor leader who was wounded in the Kennedy shooting and spent the rest of his life demanding a real investigation into the assassination. People like forensic pathologist Dr. Thomas Noguchi, who found evidence of multiple gunmen that was suppressed by authorities. People like journalist Dan Moldia, who uncovered connections between Sirhan's handlers and organized crime figures, and people like Maria Santos, who lived in terror for decades, but finally found the courage to speak the truth. In 1995, I returned to the Ambassador Hotel one final time before it was demolished. The building had been closed for years, its Art Deco elegance faded and forgotten. But as I walked through those empty corridors, I could still feel the weight of the crimes that had been committed there. I made my way to Suite 1240, where Maria had seen Sirhan with his handlers. The room had been stripped of furniture and fixtures, but I could still see the view of the hotel's kitchen area, where Kennedy had been shot. Still see how perfectly positioned the suite was for surveillance and planning. On the wall, barely visible beneath layers of peeling paint, someone had written a message. They killed him here, but the truth lives forever. I don't know who wrote those words, or when, but I know they were right. The Ambassador Hotel is gone now, demolished in 2006, and replaced by a school complex. But the truth about what happened there, the truth about Robert Kennedy's assassination and the criminal network that orchestrated it, that truth refuses to die. The men who turned the Ambassador Hotel into their personal killing ground are mostly dead now, claimed by age and the violent lifestyle that had made them rich and powerful. But their legacy lives on in the corruption that still infects American politics, in the organized crime families that continue to profit from human misery, in the intelligence agencies that learned they could manipulate public opinion by controlling the narrative around national tragedies. Robert F. Kennedy died because he threatened their power. He died because he asked uncomfortable questions and refused to accept comfortable lies. He died because he believed that America could be better than its worst impulses, and there were people who couldn't afford to let that belief spread. The Ambassador Hotel was their weapon, a place where they could plan and execute the perfect crime while maintaining plausible deniability, a place where the powerful could indulge their darkest appetites, while building the leverage they needed to control politicians, judges, and law enforcement officials. But every empire built on blood eventually falls, and the criminal network that operated out of the Ambassador Hotel is no exception. Their hotel is gone, their leaders are dead, and their secrets are finally being exposed by people who refuse to be intimidated by threats or discouraged by decades of denial. Maria Santos died of natural causes in 2018, 30 years after our first interview. But before she passed away, she gave me a final gift, a detailed map she'd drawn of the Ambassador Hotel's hidden rooms, secret passages, and surveillance equipment. A map that revealed just how extensively the building had been modified to support criminal activities. "Promise me you'll keep telling the story," were among her last words to me. "Promise me Bobby Kennedy's death won't be forgotten, and the people who killed him won't escape justice forever." I made that promise, and I intend to keep it, because the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy wasn't just about changing the course of American history. It was about proving that no one is safe from people who profit from chaos and death. The Ambassador Hotel may be gone, but the techniques perfected there, the blackmail, the mind control, the systematic corruption of American institutions, those techniques live on. They've simply moved to new locations, new hotels, new hunting grounds where predators continue to stalk their prey. Tonight, as you sleep in your own bed, remember that somewhere in America, in hotels and motels and private clubs, the descendants of the men who killed Robert Kennedy are still operating, still manipulating vulnerable people for their own gain, still using violence and intimidation to protect their secrets. The battle between good and evil that played out in the Ambassador Hotel's corridors continues today, fought by ordinary people who choose to speak truth to power, despite the personal cost. People who understand that democracy dies in darkness, and that the only way to honor the memory of those who died fighting corruption is to continue the fight ourselves. In our next chapter, we'll discover how even the most luxurious hotels can become stages for the most intimate betrayals, where love and money create a deadly cocktail that destroys everything it touches. Next crime. The Lizzie Borden Inns, Bloody Legacy, Fall River, Massachusetts. August 4th, 1892. The Borden House on 2nd Street witnessed one of America's most infamous murders. 41 axe blows that would echo through criminal history for over a century. But what happened in that Victorian mansion was just the beginning of a story that would transform a crime scene into a tourist destination, and eventually into a hotel where guests paid to sleep in the same rooms where Andrew and Abby Borden were brutally slaughtered. I've spent 17 nights at the Lizzie Borden bed and breakfast over the past decade, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that some places absorb violence so completely that they become magnets for more death. The Borden House isn't just a historical curiosity. It's a cursed location where the line between past and present dissolves, and where new crimes continue to unfold in the shadow of old ones. The transformation of 92 2nd Street from crime Scene 2 tourist attraction began in 1996, when Martha McGinn purchased the property and converted it into a bed and breakfast. She marketed it as an authentic Victorian experience, where guests could live like the Bordens, sleeping in the same beds, eating breakfast in the same dining room, and walking the same floors where Lizzie may or may not have committed the most famous murders in American history. But Martha McCune discovered something that real estate agents don't mention in their listings. When you commercialize tragedy, you invite more tragedy to take residence. The society operated like a cult, with members distributed across the country, but united by their worship of violence, and their belief that murder was an art form that should be celebrated rather than condemned. They used historical crime sites as meeting places, with the Borden House serving as their most sacred location, the place where new members were initiated through acts that I cannot and will not describe in detail. Jessica Chen hadn't been killed because she was getting too close to solving the original Borden murders. She had been recruited because the society believed she would make an ideal member. Her academic background, her detailed knowledge of criminal investigation techniques, and her obvious fascination with violence had marked her as someone who could help them perfect their own criminal activities. But Jessica had resisted their recruitment efforts, and resistance was not acceptable to people who saw murder as a sacrament. In 2007, I received an envelope with no return address containing a single photograph. Jessica Chen, very much alive, standing in what appeared to be a warehouse or industrial building. She was wearing different clothes than she'd had at the Borden house, and her hair had been cut short and dyed black, but her eyes held a blank, distant expression that I'd seen before in victims of extreme psychological trauma. On the back of the photograph, someone had written, "She learned to appreciate Lizzie's work. Perhaps you will too." I turned the photograph over to the FBI, but they claimed there wasn't enough evidence to reopen Jessica's case or investigate the Borden Society. The photograph could have been fabricated, they said. The journal entries I'd found could have been fiction. Without concrete evidence of criminal activity, there was nothing they could do. But I knew the truth, and I wasn't going to let Jessica's disappearance be forgotten. I returned to the Borden house one final time, in 2008, booking a stay during the anniversary week of the original murders. Martha McKeon had sold the property by then, unable to cope with the strange incidents and disturbing guests that seemed drawn to the location. The new owners were a couple from California who seemed genuinely unaware of the house's dark or recent history. I spent that week documenting everything I could about the house's layout, its hidden spaces, and the people who came to visit. What I observed confirmed my worst fears. The Borden Society was still active, still using the house for their gatherings, still recruiting new members from among the guests who showed the right combination of fascination and moral flexibility. On my final night, I was awakened at 3 a.m. by voices in the hallway outside my room. Peering through the keyhole, I saw figures in Victorian-era clothing moving silently through the corridor, carrying what appeared to be antique medical instruments. They moved with the confidence of people who knew the house intimately, who had been conducting these midnight activities for years without detection. I followed them as quietly as I could, down the back stairs and into the basement where Jessica Chen had made her final discovery. The false wall had been rebuilt, but I could hear voices coming from behind it, people discussing tonight's ceremony and the new candidate who shows such promise. I tried to record their conversation with my phone, but the audio came out as nothing but static and distorted whispers. I attempted to take photographs, but the images showed only empty hallways and shadows that seemed to move independently of any light source. By morning, there was no trace of the midnight visitors. The basement appeared exactly as the owners maintained it, with no evidence of the hidden room or the activities I had witnessed. When I tried to explain what I had seen, the owners politely suggested that I had been influenced by the house's atmospheric history and might have experienced a very vivid dream. But I know what I saw. just as I know what happened to Jessica Chen and the other missing guests. The Borden house has become a beacon for people who worship violence, a place where the past and present merge in ways that create new opportunities for those who see murder as a form of artistic expression. Lizzie Borden may or may not have killed her parents with an axe on August 4th, 1892. But the people who have claimed her legacy, who gather in her former home to celebrate and recreate acts of violence, are definitely killing people today. They're using the cover of historical tourism to hide their activities, recruiting new members from among the curious visitors who come seeking thrills and find themselves trapped in nightmares they never imagined. The Borden house still operates as a bed and breakfast, still welcomes guests who want to experience a piece of criminal history. But some of those guests check in and never check out, joining a society of killers who see Lizzie Borden not as a possible murderer from the past, but as an inspiration for the murders they commit today. If you're ever traveling through Massachusetts and feel tempted to spend a night in the house where the Borden murders occurred, remember Jessica Chen? Remember the 7 other people who disappeared after asking too many questions. Remember that some historical sites are preserved not to honor the victims, but to inspire those who would create new victims. The 41 axe blows that killed Andrew and Abby Borden in 1892 were just the beginning of the violence that has haunted 92 2nd Street. The real horror isn't what might have happened over a century ago, it's what continues to happen today, in a house where evil has found a permanent home and tourism provides the perfect cover for continuing crimes. Tonight, as you sleep safely in your own bed, remember that somewhere in Fall River, Massachusetts, people are gathering in a Victorian mansion to worship murder and plan new atrocities. Remember that the most dangerous killers are often the ones who hide behind historical preservation and scholarly research, using our fascination with past crimes to facilitate present ones. In our final chapter, we'll discover how modern luxury hotels have become hunting grounds for predators who use technology and wealth to perfect the art of making people disappear. Next crime: the Chateau Marmont's Silicon Valley secret, West Hollywood, California. The Chateau Marmont rises above Sunset Boulevard like a Gothic fortress, its stone walls and castle-like towers housing secrets that have destroyed careers, ended lives, and reshaped the power structure of modern America. For nearly a century, this hotel has been the preferred playground of Hollywood's elite, a place where the famous come to indulge their darkest appetites behind walls thick enough to muffle screams. But the story I'm about to tell you isn't from Hollywood's golden age of scandal and excess. This is a tale from our digital present, where Silicon Valley billionaires have discovered that the Chateau Marmont's legendary discretion extends far beyond protecting celebrity affairs and drug habits. It's a story about how technology moguls use ancient stones and modern surveillance to create the perfect hunting ground for predators with unlimited resources and no moral boundaries. The case began for me on March 15, 2019, when I received a call from Detective Sarah Chen of the Los Angeles Police Department. Sarah and I had worked together on several high-profile cases, and she knew I had sources in both the entertainment industry and the tech world that could provide insights her official investigation couldn't access. "We have a situation at the Chateau Marmont," Sarah said, her voice tight with frustration. "A young woman named Rebecca Martinez disappeared from the hotel 3 days ago. 23 years old, software engineer from San Francisco, no history of mental health issues or substance abuse. She was attending a tech conference in LA and staying at the chateau as a guest of someone she'd met online." Rebecca Martinez had been working as a cybersecurity specialist for a small startup in San Francisco, focusing on protecting individual privacy in an age of corporate surveillance. Her work had brought her to the attention of several major tech companies, and she had been recruited aggressively by firms offering salaries that would have made her wealthy beyond her dreams. But Rebecca was more interested in exposing corporate wrongdoing than profiting from it. She had been investigating illegal data collection practices, corporate espionage, and the ways tech companies used their platforms to manipulate user behavior for profit. Her research had made her enemies in Silicon Valley's most powerful circles. She was supposed to meet with a venture capitalist about funding for her own cybersecurity firm, Sarah explained. Someone who contacted her through professional networking sites offered her a meeting at the Chateau Marmont because it was discreet and convenient. She checked in on March 12th and was supposed to check out on the 14th. Hotel staff found her room empty with all her belongings still there. I first visited the Lizzie Borden house in 2003, researching a book about historical crime scenes that had been repurposed for tourism. What I found was a meticulously preserved Victorian mansion that felt wrong from the moment I crossed the threshold. The air was too thick, the shadows too deep, and the silence too complete, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next act of violence to unfold. Martha McGinn gave me a tour that first day, and I could see the toll that 11 years of operating a murder house had taken on her. She was thin, nervous, constantly looking over her shoulder as if she expected to find someone following her. Through the corridors where Andrew and Abby Borden had met their violent end, "Strange things happen here," she admitted, as we stood in the guest room that had been Andrew and Abby's bedroom. Guests report seeing figures in the hallways, hearing voices from empty rooms, finding their belongings moved during the night. But that's not what worries me. What worried Martha were the living visitors, people who came to the house not as curious tourists, but as pilgrims drawn to a shrine of violence, people who seemed to know details about the murders that weren't in any guidebook, who asked questions about the crime scene that made her uncomfortable, who stayed too long and watched too carefully. "There's a network," Martha explained, her voice dropping to a whisper. "People who collect murder memorabilia, who trade information about crime scenes, who worship killers like other people worship celebrities. They find each other through the internet, and places like this become their meeting grounds." She showed me a guest book filled with entries that chilled my blood. Visitors who signed in using the names of famous serial killers. Guests who left detailed descriptions of how they would have committed the Borden murders differently. People who wrote love letters to Lizzie Borden, praising her for showing the world that women can be just as violent as men. But the most disturbing entries were the ones that seemed to be coded messages, seemingly innocent comments that Martha had learned to recognize as communications between members of what she called the murder community. People planning meetings, sharing information about other crime scenes, coordinating activities that she preferred not to think about too deeply. My second visit to the Borden house came in 2005, when Martha called me in a panic. A guest had disappeared during the night, simply vanished from a locked room on the second floor, leaving behind all their belongings and no explanation for how they had left the house without triggering the security system. Jessica Chen was a 24-year-old graduate student from Boston University, researching Victorian-era crime for her master's thesis. She had booked a 2-night stay at the Borden house, specifically requesting the John Morse room, the guest room, where Lizzie's uncle had slept on the night of the murders. Jessica checked in on October 13, 2005, carrying a suitcase full of research materials and a digital camera she planned to use to document the house's interior. Martha remembered her as polite but intense, someone who seemed more interested in the forensic details of the murders than the historical atmosphere. She asked questions that made me uncomfortable, Martha told me when I arrived to investigate Jessica's disappearance. She wanted to know about the exact angle of the axe blows, about blood spatter patterns that weren't preserved, about whether we'd ever found additional evidence in the walls or floorboards. It was like she was trying to solve the case herself. Jessica spent her first day at the house taking hundreds of photographs and measurements, mapping the crime scenes with the precision of a professional investigator. She ate dinner alone in the dining room where the Borden family had shared their last meal and went to bed early, claiming she wanted to experience the house at the same time the murders occurred. The next morning, Martha found Jessica's room empty. The bed had been slept in, but there was no sign of the guest herself. Her suitcase was still in the closet, her research materials spread across the desk, her camera sitting on the windowsill with dozens of photos of the house's interior. But Jessica Chen was gone, and she had left the house without opening any doors or windows that were connected to the security system. Fall River Police treated it as a missing person case, but their investigation was perfunctory at best. Jessica was an adult with no history of mental illness or substance abuse, and there was no evidence of foul play. The assumption was that she had left voluntarily, perhaps overwhelmed by staying in such a macabre location, but I knew better. I had spent enough time investigating crimes connected to historical murder sites to recognize the patterns. Jessica hadn't left voluntarily. She had been taken by someone who knew the Borden house better than any tourist should. I spent 3 days examining Jessica's research materials, and what I found convinced me that she had discovered something significant about the original murders. Her notes referenced inconsistencies in the official timeline and evidence of additional participants in the Borden killings. Jessica had been corresponding with other researchers through email, sharing theories about the possibility that Lizzie Borden hadn't acted alone. She believed that the murders had been part of a larger conspiracy involving multiple family members and possibly outside accomplices, people who had helped cover up the crime and who might still have living descendants with reasons to keep the truth hidden. Her final email, sent at 11:47 p.m. on the night she disappeared, contained a single line: "I found something in the basement. If anything happens to me, look behind the furnace." Martha initially refused to let me examine the basement, claiming it was off limits to guests and contained only mechanical equipment. But when I pointed out that Jessica's safety might depend on following up her final communication, she reluctantly agreed to let me search the area behind the furnace. What we found there changed everything. I thought I knew about the Borden murders, and about the people who had been using the house for their own dark purposes in the years since it became a bed and breakfast, hidden behind a false wall that had been constructed sometime after 1996. We discovered a collection of items that seemed to span more than a century. Newspaper clippings about the Borden murders, dating back to 1892. Photographs of the crime scene that had never been released to the public. Personal letters written by Lizzie Borden during her trial. But the most disturbing discoveries were recent additions to the collection. Digital photographs of current guests sleeping in their rooms, taken without their knowledge or consent. Detailed floor plans of the house showing hidden passages that didn't appear on any official blueprints. And a journal documenting the activities of what the writer called the Borden Society, a group of people who met regularly at the house to honor the legacy of Lizzie's courage. The journal entries describe ceremonies conducted in the basement during the late-night hours when guests were sleeping upstairs. Rituals that involved recreating the murders using mannequins and stage blood, and discussions about identifying worthy successors to Lizzie Borden, people who could be initiated into the society's inner circle. Jessica Chen's name appeared in the final entry, along with a note that she had shown exceptional promise but would need to be tested. To determine her worthiness, I called the Fall River Police immediately, but by the time they arrived to investigate, the hidden room had been emptied. Someone with access to the house had removed all the evidence we'd discovered, leaving behind only empty shelves and the lingering smell of decay. The investigation into Jessica's disappearance was quietly closed 6 months later, officially ruled a voluntary missing person case. But I continued my own investigation, tracking down former guests who had stayed at the Borden house and noticed unusual activities. What I discovered was a pattern of disappearances and mysterious incidents stretching back to the house's opening as a bed and breakfast. At least 7 guests had vanished without explanation over the years, all of them young people with academic or professional interests in criminal justice. All of them had been asking probing questions about the original murders. All of them had left behind research materials suggesting they were close to uncovering new information about the case. But the Borden Society wasn't just interested in preserving the memory of Lizzie's alleged crimes. They were actively creating new ones. Using the house as a base of operations, they had developed a network of people obsessed with violence and murder. People who saw Lizzie Borden as a pioneer who had shown them that ordinary citizens could commit extraordinary acts of brutality. I spent months infiltrating online communities where members of the Borden Society communicated, using fake identities and carefully constructed personas to gain their trust. What I learned horrified me beyond anything I had encountered in 20 years of crime reporting. I agreed to help with the investigation, but as I drove up to the Chateau Marmont that evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that Rebecca Martinez had walked into a trap that had been years in the making. The hotel's reputation for protecting celebrity privacy had evolved into something far more sinister. A guarantee of absolute secrecy that attracted predators who needed to ensure their crimes would never be reported. The Chateau Marmont, in 2019, was a very different place from the bohemian artistic retreat it had been in previous decades. Tech money had discovered the hotel, and Silicon Valley executives had begun using it as their Los Angeles headquarters for activities they couldn't risk conducting in the heavily monitored corporate environments of San Francisco and Palo Alto. Hotel manager Patricia Gonzalez had been working at the chateau for 15 years, and she agreed to speak with me off the record about the changes she'd witnessed. We met in the hotel's garden restaurant, surrounded by the kind of lush landscaping that muffles conversations and provides privacy from prying eyes. The tech people are different from our traditional guests, Patricia explained, glancing around nervously to ensure we weren't being overheard. The entertainers who stay here are looking for freedom, freedom to be themselves without judgment, freedom to experiment with their public image. But the tech executives, they're looking for control. Control over information, control over people, control over situations that could damage their carefully constructed public personas. Patricia described how certain suites at the chateau had been modified with sophisticated surveillance equipment, not to spy on the guests, but to record activities that could be used as leverage in business negotiations or personal relationships. Tech executives would invite rivals, journalists, or potential whistleblowers to the hotel, then use hidden cameras and recording devices to capture compromising material. They call it gathering intelligence, Patricia said, but it's really just high-tech blackmail. They use the material to silence critics, manipulate stock prices, and eliminate competition. The hotel's reputation for discretion becomes there. Weapon people trust that what happens here stays here, so they let their guard down. The suite where Rebecca Martinez had been staying, Suite 29, on the hotel's third floor, was one of the locations that had been modified with the most sophisticated surveillance equipment. But Patricia noticed something unusual about Rebecca's reservation. It had been booked not by Rebecca herself, but by a shell company that Patricia had seen used by other tech executives for their most sensitive meetings. She was being set up, Patricia told me. Someone wanted her in that specific room, with all that recording equipment, for a reason that had nothing to do with venture capital funding. I spent the next 3 days investigating Rebecca's background and the circumstances that had brought her to the Chateau Marmont. What I discovered was a web of corporate espionage, illegal surveillance, and systematic intimidation that reached into the highest levels of Silicon Valley's power structure. Rebecca Martinez hadn't just been investigating data, privacy violations. She had uncovered evidence of a coordinated effort by major tech companies to manipulate democratic elections, suppress dissenting voices, and create psychological profiles of millions of users that were being sold to foreign governments and criminal organizations. Her research had identified specific executives who were profiting from these illegal activities, and she had been preparing to release her findings through a major news organization when she received the invitation to meet with the mysterious venture capitalist at the Chateau Marmont. The invitation had come through a professional networking platform that specialized in connecting tech workers with potential investors. But when I traced the account that had contacted Rebecca, I discovered it was fake, created with stolen identity, information, and maintained by a digital security firm that specialized in corporate espionage and reputation management. The firm, Phoenix Digital Solutions, operated out of a nondescript office building in Menlo Park, and their client list included some of the most recognizable names in Silicon Valley. Their services included competitor analysis, threat assessment, and strategic neutralization of hostile actors, corporate euphemisms for spying on rivals, identifying potential whistleblowers, and silencing anyone who threatened their clients' interests. I managed to schedule a meeting with Phoenix Digital's founder, Marcus Webb, by posing as a journalist working on a positive profile of innovative Bay Area startups. Webb was a former NSA analyst who had left government service to provide intelligence services to private clients, and he was eager to discuss his company's cutting-edge technology and impressive client roster. The digital age has created new vulnerabilities for successful companies, Webb explained as he gave me a tour of his firm's high-tech facilities. Disgruntled employees can leak sensitive information instantly to millions of people. Competitors can use social media to spread false narratives about products or executives. Foreign governments can manipulate online conversations to damage American companies. Webb's solution was a comprehensive surveillance and manipulation system that monitored potential threats across all digital platforms, created fake online identities to influence public opinion, and when necessary, eliminated threats through methods he described as targeted intervention. Sometimes the most effective approach is to remove the threat entirely, Webb said, his smile never wavering even as he described activities that sounded suspiciously like kidnapping and murder. We identify individuals who pose risks to our clients. We study their behaviors and motivations, and we develop strategies to neutralize them before they can cause damage. When I asked about Rebecca Martinez specifically, Webb's expression didn't change, but I noticed his hand move instinctively toward a panic button on his desk. "I'm not familiar with that name," he said, "but if someone was threatening our clients' legitimate business interests, we would certainly take appropriate action to protect them." That evening, I returned to the Chateau Marmont to examine Suite 29 more carefully. Using equipment provided by a contact in the electronics industry, I was able to detect multiple hidden cameras and recording devices throughout the room, all of them connected to a sophisticated data storage system that could transmit recordings in real time to remote servers. But I also found something else, traces of sedatives in the room's ventilation system, suggesting that guests could be drugged without their knowledge. The suite had been designed not just to record compromising activities, but to create situations where guests would be vulnerable to manipulation or abduction. As I was completing my examination of the suite, I heard voices in the hallway outside. Peering through the peephole, I saw 3 men in expensive suits who definitely weren't hotel guests or staff. They were discussing the Martinez cleanup and ensuring complete data sanitization. Corporate speak that made my blood run cold. I managed to record part of their conversation using my phone, and what I captured confirmed my worst fears about what had happened to Rebecca Martinez. She hadn't just disappeared, she had been systematically eliminated by people who saw murder as simply another business expense. The subject proved more resistant than anticipated. One of the men said standard psychological manipulation techniques were ineffective. Physical intervention became necessary. They discussed locations where biological materials had been disposed of, methods used to cleanse digital footprints, and strategies for discouraging further investigation by amateur researchers who might ask uncomfortable questions. When they mentioned my name specifically, I realized that my investigation had put me on their target list. They knew I was asking questions about Rebecca's disappearance, and they were planning to handle me the same way they had handled her. I spent the rest of that night carefully documenting everything I had discovered, uploading files to secure servers, and preparing evidence packages that would be automatically released if anything happened to me. Then I called Detective Sarah Chen and arranged to meet her at a location far from the Chateau. Sarah listened to my recordings and reviewed my evidence with the grim expression of someone who understood that we were dealing with criminals who operated above the law. The men I had overheard weren't just hired killers. They were part of a network that provided problem-solving services to tech executives who couldn't afford to let whistleblowers damage their companies or their personal wealth. This goes deeper than one missing person, Sarah said as we reviewed the material. I'd gathered. We're looking at a systematic elimination program targeting anyone who threatens Silicon Valley's power structure. Journalists, researchers, former employees, government regulators, anyone who gets too close to the truth about how these companies really operate. But our investigation hit a wall when we tried to pursue official channels. The tech executives implicated in Rebecca's disappearance had connections throughout California's political and law enforcement systems. Evidence disappeared from police custody. Witnesses changed their stories or refused to cooperate. The case was quietly transferred to federal authorities, who claimed it was related to national security issues that couldn't be discussed publicly. Rebecca Martinez was officially classified as a voluntary missing person, despite overwhelming evidence that she had been murdered by corporate assassins. Her research into tech industry crimes was dismissed as the paranoid delusions of a mentally unstable individual. The surveillance equipment at the Chateau Marmont was quietly removed, and the hotel's management claimed no knowledge of any activities beyond normal hospitality services. But the story doesn't end there, because the network that killed Rebecca Martinez is still operating today, still using luxury hotels as hunting grounds, still targeting anyone who threatens the profits and power of America's tech oligarchy. 6 months after Rebecca's disappearance, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a hard drive containing terabytes of data, financial records, communication logs, surveillance footage, and audio recordings that documented years of criminal activity by Phoenix Digital Solutions and their clients. The material revealed a systematic program of intimidation, blackmail, and murder targeting. Critics of the tech industry, journalists who had written unfavorable articles about data privacy, researchers who had exposed algorithmic bias, former employees who had attempted to blow the whistle on illegal activities, government officials who had proposed increased regulation of tech companies. All of them had been eliminated through methods designed to look like accidents, suicides, or voluntary disappearances. All of them had been lured to meetings at luxury hotels, where they could be isolated, manipulated, and disposed of without attracting attention. The hard drive also contained video footage from the Chateau Marmont, showing Rebecca Martinez's final hours. She had indeed met with someone claiming to be a venture capitalist, a man who had fed her drugged wine, waited for her to become incapacitated, then calmly made phone calls to arrange for her removal and disposal. I turned all of this evidence over to federal authorities, but within weeks, the investigation was classified and sealed. The officials I had been working with were transferred to other assignments or took early retirement. Phoenix Digital Solutions quietly dissolved, but their key personnel moved to other firms, providing identical services under different names. The network that killed Rebecca Martinez adapted and evolved, but it didn't disappear. If anything, it became more sophisticated, using advanced artificial intelligence to identify potential threats and more subtle methods to eliminate them. If you made it this far into the darkness with us tonight, leave a comment with the word Shadow, so we know you're one of the brave ones, willing to face the truth about how power really operates in modern America today. Tech executives continue to use luxury hotels as neutral ground for activities they can't risk conducting in their corporate offices. The Chateau Marmont still offers the same discretion it always has, but that discretion now protects criminals who see murder as simply another form of market manipulation. Rebecca Martinez died because she believed the public had a right to know how their personal data was being used, how their democratic institutions were being manipulated, and how their privacy was being sold to the highest bidder. She died because she threatened the wealth and power of people who had never been held accountable for their crimes. But her research lives on, hidden in secure servers, and distributed among journalists who understand that some stories are worth dying for. Her evidence continues to expose the methods used by tech companies to control information, manipulate public opinion, and eliminate threats to their power. The battle Rebecca fought, the battle between transparency and corporate secrecy, between individual privacy and algorithmic surveillance, between democratic accountability and oligarchic control, that battle continues today. It's fought in courtrooms and newsrooms, in corporate boardrooms and hotel suites, in the digital spaces where our modern lives unfold. Every time you use a search engine, post on social media, or share personal information online, you're participating in a system that was built by the same people who killed Rebecca Martinez. Every time you accept terms of service without reading them, install apps that demand excessive permissions, or trust corporations with your most intimate data, you're feeding the machine that turns human privacy into corporate profit. The Chateau Marmont still stands on Sunset Boulevard, still offers luxury accommodations to guests who value discretion above all else. But remember, as you walk past its Gothic towers and ancient stones, that some secrets are protected by blood, and some discretion comes at a price, measured in human lives. The tech executives who used that hotel as their private killing ground have moved on to other locations, other methods, other victims, but their appetite for control, for secrecy, for the elimination of anyone who threatens their power, that appetite remains unsatisfied and eternal. Tonight, as you turn off your devices and try to sleep, remember Rebecca Martinez. Remember that somewhere in Silicon Valley, in luxury hotels and corporate boardrooms, people are planning new ways to monitor your behavior, manipulate your choices, and silence your voice if you dare to speak truth to their power. Remember that the most dangerous criminals in modern America aren't the ones who break into your home. They're the ones you invite into your life every time you accept their platforms, their services, their promises of connection and convenience. The digital age has created new forms of violence, new methods of control, new ways for the powerful to eliminate threats while maintaining the illusion of innocence. The algorithms that shape what you see online, the platforms that connect you to friends and family, the services that make modern life possible. They're all weapons in a war most people don't even realize is being fought. Rebecca Martinez understood that war, fought in that war, and died in that war. Her story is a warning to all of us that the price of digital convenience is measured in human freedom, and the cost of staying connected to the modern world might be surrendering our souls to the very people who would destroy us to protect their profits. As our journey through these hotel corridors of horror comes to an end, remember that the most terrifying monsters aren't the ones that hide under beds or lurk in dark alleys. The most terrifying monsters are the ones that wear expensive suits, live in Silicon Valley mansions, and kill with keyboards instead of knives. They're still out there, still hunting, still using our trust in technology to facilitate crimes that would have been impossible in any previous era. And they're waiting for the next Rebecca Martinez to get too close to the truth, so they can demonstrate once again that, in the digital age, information isn't just power, it's the power to decide who lives and who dies. Good night, and sweet dreams.